And after I went back to writing these speeches on pieces of paper instead of the technology, I have to drop it as soon as I get here. Thank you very, very much for the energy that's here in the room and for all of the contributions to discussions so far. And I want to begin by thanking, first of all, Per for joining us and for giving us such a clear and inspiring sense of what you're achieving in Sweden. And can I also just pay tribute very briefly to the technical folk up at the back who've managed to achieve camera angles that work both for Per and for myself. I think that's a quite amazing achievement. But Per, because you studied in Scotland, you will be very aware of the Scottish tradition of offering a quaich, a symbol of friendship, to our guests, and so I'd like to do that now. You'll be pleased it's a very resource-efficient quaich, but we would very much like you to accept this.
Oh, thank you so much.
So it has been another fantastic year here in Scotland. The energy and the creativity and the commitment that you all put into our council elections was astonishing, and I want to thank all of you for that. We've got more councillors elected in more places in Scotland than ever before. We've got the balance of power in Scotland's two biggest cities. We're the biggest political party on Orkney Council. Okay, we're the only political party on Orkney Council, but we're the biggest political party on Orkney Council. And there are many, many more wards, many, many more communities around Scotland where we made real progress, where we came close, where we have shown that there is great potential lying ahead. So I want to echo Susan's opening remarks to you. If you see yourself as the councillor, the Green councillor that your community needs, let's make sure that we work together over the coming years to give you that opportunity, to give your community that opportunity, so that we see even more Greens elected next time. But as well as that incredible year for the Greens, in many ways, it's been a year of crisis for the UK government, for the Tory party, for the chaotic Brexit process, and potentially for Europe itself. It's really important, therefore, that we have colleagues here from other European countries to say, we are still part of the European project. We are still part of the European Green political family, and we are still committed to Scotland's future in Europe. Now, although that emergency motion wasn't debated just now, we do have time later in the conference to debate the position and to make decisions on our approach to Brexit. But just to contrast for a moment that tale of two referendums Scotland has gone through, one in which so many more people throughout our countries, actually on both sides, became engaged in the political debate about the nature of our politics, the nature of power in our society, the nature of our economy, and became politically engaged. Compare that with the EU referendum, in which no plan was offered, no detail was published, and a simplistic slogan of "take back control" was used to distract people from the really deep, meaningful questions about how power is exercised. Well, we've responded so far. Ross Greer's work on the Preparing for Impact paper that we published really recently is important, and we'll hear about that later in the conference, opposing that power grab that's coming from the UK, standing up for free movement, making sure that we stand against any new reservations of what should be devolved powers, and going further, saying that immigration, workers' rights, these are the areas where we should be arguing Scotland needs to be able to have control over those powers as devolved areas. enshrining the Charter of Fundamental Rights, making sure that we don't lose those vital protections, but also standing up in the Scottish Parliament and ensuring that power there is accountable as well. If the Scottish ministers are given the ability to rewrite our laws, as the UK ministers want to do at Westminster, they must be held accountable to Parliament. And we absolutely need to ensure that the new environmental functions are given to the agencies which will operate them independently. We must challenge the recent Scottish Government decision not to create a new specialist environmental court, for example. That case has already been strong. Brexit makes that case all the stronger, should make it irresistible, and we'll stand up for that change as well. The progress that we've seen, though, for green ideas in Scotland, I believe fully justifies the title of our conference this weekend, shows that we are leading the change in Scottish politics. The list of green achievements is long and getting longer. We're seeing action on polluting vehicles to improve the air quality in our cities. We're seeing action, the ability for councils to take action on the gouging of people for excessive rental prices in the private rented market. We're seeing the creation of a deposit return scheme that Greens have pushed for a long time. We've seen a commitment. I was really pleased to be able to work with Claire Bailey, who we'll be seeing more of and hearing more from later in the conference, a commitment to ensure that the Scottish Government will change the rules to ensure that those women who are forced to travel from Northern Ireland to access abortion can at least do so on the NHS in Scotland and don't face any additional prices from having to access private provision. We've seen Alison Johnson's fantastic work in showing how Scotland can protect people from benefit sanctions, and our advocacy of a young carers allowance, which we will now see become a reality because we're leading the change on that issue as well. And from the fracking ban to the recent announcement of a publicly owned energy company in Scotland, it's clear that the positive, constructive green policies that we've been pushing for years are making real progress. And Mark Ruskell is absolutely right in moving that emergency motion, that we need to lock that in for the future. I'm very pleased that you passed that emergency motion. On public energy, it's really exciting that this is finally, after years of our making the case, on the agenda, and we've won greater consensus that Scotland doesn't just need to swap a bunch of fossil fuel multinationals for renewable multinationals instead, but that we can also transform the ownership of our energy system as we transform the technology. But we've consistently said that there's a strong case for that ownership to be diverse, locally owned energy companies, community organisations, truly decentralised ownership, and we will keep making that case. And there's growing support for long-standing core green ideas like land value tax, which the Scottish Government are finally going to explore, and even for a universal basic income, and a new fund announced to allow the Scottish Government to support initiatives at local level to put that idea into practice. Now, obviously, it would be far easier to fully develop that idea in the context of Scottish independence. But we've put this idea onto the agenda in a way that would once have seemed like a distant hope. In fact, many of these areas where Greens are leading the change in Scottish politics, the fracking ban, rent controls, ending the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles, all this, even just a few years ago, would have felt like a long way off. And it's clear that we have much more progress ahead of us. Even the Conservatives seem to be recognising the truth that we're the ones leading the change in Scotland. Annie Wells, their MSP for Glasgow, was quoted today as saying, "Given how much the Greens' agenda has been mimicked by the SNP, it's hardly surprising that we're boasting about our influence over the Scottish Government." Well, it feels a little strange saying this, but I agree with Annie Wells. Can I Can I say that? I agree with Annie Wells? Okay. If there was any moment for me to have a coughing fit, I think that was it. The truth is, though, that the SNP are not the only ones who've been inspired by green ideas and where we are leading the change. In fact, the Conservatives have picked up on one of the ideas that Andy Whiteman has been promoting about making land available to councils at its existing use value to make the provision of housing much more affordable. That idea, the fact that they've picked that up, demonstrates that right across the political spectrum, green ideas are making an impact. They're even talking about the beginnings, the inadequate beginnings of intervention in the energy market, and finally recognizing the generational inequality that their own policies have created. They're talking, though, about changes to tax rates based on age. We know that they must be based on wealth and income. I personally don't see why Ross Greer needs a tax cut. Sorry, mate. The Tories are even trying to present themselves as a pro-equality party. I was down in London, actually, for the Pink News Awards, and Theresa May, who once defended Section 28, now thinks she can go there and be taken seriously, making a speech about how important equality is to the Conservative Party. Well, she did actually cough once, and a little ripple went through the room. But I think she was as aware as the audience was of quite how contradictory that position is. Her colleagues, though, in Scotland do seem a little bit more muddled on some issues. Adam Tompkins, who just last year was praising the idea of citizens' income, a universal basic income, as just the kind of reform that's needed, now clearly has got the message from Ruth Davison that no, the system we have right now is successfully demeaning people, humiliating people, and keeping people in poverty, so we'll just stick with that plan and keep on making it worse. And of course, rather than their old slogan of getting back to the day job, as we've had it, I've heard that their well-known linesman, Douglas Ross, has been taking occasional days off to be an MP at Westminster. Well, let's just look forward to watching Ruth crumble on the bake-off. Yeah, I didn't think that one would play well either. As for the Labour Party, again, more green ideas lifted. And goodness knows they need to, because Scottish Labour, just like the SNP, has been in need of fresh new ideas. And I think they'll continue to be in need of fresh new ideas, quite regardless of whether their leadership election is won by the centrist dad or the other one no one's heard of. The case that needs to be made, though, about the way Greens are leading the change is that by constantly pushing at the boundaries of what is politically possible, we not only put new, fresh ideas onto the agenda, but we expand the space in Scottish politics and we make it possible for other parties. We make it necessary for other parties to move their positions as well. So it's no surprise in many ways to see the Labour Party lifting the idea of the Scotland Guarantee for young people directly off the pages of our 2016 manifesto. Exploring the idea that when a business is failing or being sold, it's the employees who should have the right to buy it. And using devolved powers to add a top-up to child benefit. Every single one of them, ideas where Greens have been leading the change. And on the bills that our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament are presenting at the moment, we're seeing yet again new areas where we're leading the change, where growing support is being seen for our ideas. As for the work that John Finney has done so impressively on making the case for equal protection for young people from assault, I think we've all been amazed to see the scale I think we've all been amazed to see the scale of support that's grown and so quickly from children's organisations to the police, coming out and backing John's proposal. And all opposition parties, except for the Conservatives, now backing us as well as the government. It's interesting to look at where the opposition really is coming from. That some familiar faces from the campaigns against LGBTI equality, against sex education, against reproductive rights. I see that the Christian Institute are backing their now Be Reasonable campaign to allow people to carry on using physical punishment against children. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. Well, we're so reasonable that every single time you'll find us on the other side of a debate from the Christian Institute. We've been so successful at leading the change that even the Daily Mail wants to get in on the act, stealing some green clothes. Their political editor claimed recently that the paper has had more successful environmental campaigns than the Greens. Sadly, he was making this claim in defence of the paper having published pro-fracking views by a climate denier. So I think they've perhaps got some little way to go yet. And Mark Ruskell's bill, again, growing support being shown for his proposal to make our streets safer, for children and for everyone. Something that's seeing more and more support from all of those pesky experts, the people who some politicians may have had enough of, but people who know what they're talking about. And huge numbers of people in communities as well who want their local neighbourhoods to be safer, cleaner places. 20 miles an hour as the default in residential areas, yet another area where Greens are leading the change and where others take time to catch up, but ultimately they do. But this is nothing new. This is nothing new. This is what Greens have always done. From our earliest days in the early 1970s, through the 80s, the 90s, the years before fair voting systems, before a Scottish Parliament, and since the devolution era as well. Constantly, Greens have been there pushing at the edges of what is politically possible, creating that political space and giving people a reason to believe that something other than middle-of-the-road, business-as-usual politics is possible and necessary. But as I've said before, it's not enough just to be right and to pat ourselves on the back for that and then watch others take a decade to catch up. We have a responsibility never to rest on our laurels and keep pushing at those boundaries. We're an electoral party, even throughout those long years before we had anyone in elected office. It was by standing for elections that we had the opportunity to put those ideas onto the agenda. We wouldn't be where we are now with this success and with this influence built up if we'd only decided to stand for elections when we knew that it would be easy to get elected. We need to be ready and prepared to keep on doing that if we want to build our success. And as we've seen Greens move from campaigning to holding elected office, to holding the balance of power, and in many other European countries like Sweden, moving into government, that's when we begin to accelerate. That's when we don't have to wait a decade for others to catch up. That's when we can put our ideas directly into practice. Now we've got a number of areas for immediate challenge where we need to be putting the Scottish Government on the spot. Education reform is one of them, not just on the governance issues where Ross Greer has been challenging, but also on issues like sex education and equality, issues that Ross, I think, almost single-handedly put onto the agenda of the Scottish Parliament's Education Committee. And working as well with the Scottish Young Greens, whose Healthy Minds campaign on mental health education is going to be a really important message for us to put out there about the kinds of change that are needed. We're certainly not the kind of people, though, who will pretend that everything in our public services is falling apart or is dreadful. If Scottish education can produce Green ministers, then I think we absolutely need to recognise the value of that. But there are people working in public services right across our society who absolutely need our support, who are not being adequately supported, not being adequately resourced. And so the budget that's coming up in the next few weeks and months is going to be critically important. We should take credit. We should take credit that the aviation tax apparently will not be cut this year. And I understand if Derek Mackay, the finance minister, needs to find a way of blaming Westminster to kick it into the long grass. If he wants to save his blushes in that way, that's fine for now. But there is no case substantively that has been made for this aviation tax cut. Not environmentally, not socially, not even economically, or in terms of the simple transport priorities. Most people in Scotland know that they'd be far better off if we made their public transport affordable, reliable and convenient, rather than cutting taxes for the aviation industry. So while I do hope that the Heathrow-funded free bar at SNP conference was a little bit glummer this year than last, I want them to be miserable next year. I want by next year that policy not only paused, but scrapped altogether. Public sector pay is going to be one of the most important issues in that budget discussion. And there is, I think now, an unanswerable case for an above-inflation pay settlement for people delivering the public services that every single one of us in Scotland depend on every day of our lives. And I think we can win that. I think we can achieve that. The Scottish Government have said that they'll lift the pay cap. Well, that's a good start, but simply lifting the cap isn't enough. We need to recognise that higher inflation now means we have to go above and beyond that figure, and it has to be fully funded. If the Scottish Government lifts the pay cap but doesn't provide all of the rest of the public sector with the resources necessary, then it will make very little difference. So it has to be funded and it has to be above inflation, restoring the lost value that people have seen taken out of their pay packets. We need to have the same principle on our local government services as well. I think we should be proud of the achievement, that 160 million reversal of cuts that we achieved in last year's budget. But the years before that saw deeper cuts still. We need to be restoring the lost value in our public funding for local services right throughout Scotland. And we need also to ensure that we're investing in low-carbon infrastructure. The Scottish Government has been told it needs to be spending at least 70% of its capital spending on low-carbon infrastructure, and we'll want progress on that as well. And we can't do any of this. We can't do any of this without tax reform as well. And so the position that we advocated in the 2016 election, though the specific figures may need to be updated, the core principles are very, very clear. We want to raise enough revenue to fund the public services and the investment that our country needs, and we want to do it in a way that closes the inequality gap instead of hitting low earners in the pocket. That means we need a better approach to progressive taxation. We'll be absolutely advocating for that, and I'm really pleased that movement is happening on that as well. We're leading the change on that argument, whether you see voices on the Labour or the SNP side accepting the case that it's not just a debate on the basic rate anymore. We need fairer, genuinely progressive taxation. And if I'm not paying more tax, if MSPs aren't paying more tax by the end of it, then I think that will be an inadequate settlement. We need to ensure that we protect low earners and ensure that those who genuinely can afford to pay more do so. So the message to Derek Mackay as he prepares his budget is very clear. If you want Green support, these are the areas where you're going to have to listen and you're going to have to act. Friends, I want to talk for a few moments about where things go from here. I've talked about the immediate priorities, and I'll add to that the coming climate change legislation. Climate change legislation is one of these areas where we're legislating now, but for the long term in mind. And sadly, the Scottish Government's proposals so far actually amount to a slowdown. Their proposals for the next set of carbon emission targets would represent a slower rate of emissions reductions than we've achieved over the last decade. In the wake of the Paris Agreement, we need to be accelerating our action for that long term and demonstrating that it is possible. Not only that it's possible, but that it can lead to a better, fairer, and more successful society for us to live in. So we need to go, taking a leaf again from the books of Sweden and other European countries that have already set net zero emission targets. That's where we should be going with the new climate change legislation. But there's also a question about how we communicate these ideas. And I would like us all to consider this a little bit over the coming days. There's always been a sense that our critics want to accuse us of doom-mongering, while Greens want to point to the idea of a better, brighter future. And there's a moment now happening where many, especially in the environmental movement more broadly around the world, are saying this is a time for optimism. This is a time for optimism about the turning point the world could be making at the moment. We're seeing a plateau globally of emissions. We're seeing an extraordinary growth of renewables in the last few years. We're seeing land being returned to nature, more of it now than is being deforested. We're seeing some whale populations recovering after many, many years of suffering. We're seeing oil spills at an historic low. There are many people saying this should be a moment where we talk about optimism. I think that might be a little simplistic. It must always be balanced with the hard reality about the urgency of the problems that we face. But there is a case for positivity. There is a very strong case for ensuring that not only the purposes for which we exist, challenging the social and environmental crises that we face, or the economic causes of both, allows us to offer positive and transformational ideas about something better. Because it's only, if we only talk about the problems, we risk moving people from denial as a reason for inaction into defeatism as a reason for inaction. To take action, we need to know that solutions are possible. And that can't just be an article of faith. We need to show people that success is being achieved. And that's why our political achievements in leading the change in Scottish politics, at Holyrood and at local level, the results of the political influence that we built up over the years, that's why these achievements are so important. If we expect to inspire people to know that a greener world is not only possible, but that it's a world they'd love to live in, we need to be able to point to the reality of our successes. So these individual policy areas where we're working, they need to help us to set out that positive ideas. Not just talking about CO2 parts per million or rent pressure zones and technocratic terms like that. We need to talk about cleaner air, quieter streets, cheaper rents, lower energy bills, healthier homes, safer children, and communities with the confidence and the opportunity to speak for themselves and make choices for themselves. The kind of thing that would make a slogan like "Take Back Control" actually mean something constructive and positive. So we need to apply more of this positivity to the core green ideas that define us. Not just challenging the myopic growth economics, but saying what prosperity could really mean in the age after we've given up those narrow, blinkered approaches. Not just talking about divestment away from the fossil fuel industry, the arms industry, all the bad stuff we want to move on, but talking about investment into an ethical economy, one in which we not only create high-value, rewarding, successful jobs that will last for the long term, but where we redefine work as being something that changes from just servicing multinationals or those extracting wealth from our economy, but where work becomes something genuinely fulfilling for human needs and about investing and creating wealth for people's own communities. Leading the change. It is what Greens have always done. Pushing at the edge of what's politically possible and forcing others onto the ground that we open up. The first to make meaningful calls for action on issues from climate change, radical land reform, equal marriage, ideas that are now increasingly mainstream. And even though it takes others time to catch up, we must never stop. More than just the critical challenges we face, we have the opportunity, the real positive opportunity to act, ending inequality in our society and turning environmental challenges into a spur for a better economy. Facing down the recklessly destructive Brexit power grabs, but becoming advocates through that for democracy, for free movement, and for our country's positive future in Europe. Responding always with practical ideas and showing that our successes can inspire people with a vision of what's possible. Friends, we will never stop pushing at the boundaries of what's possible. We will never become the kind of political party that tries to win by offering a safe, unchallenging middle ground agenda. We'll keep advocating investment in the strong and successful post-oil economy that lies ahead and finding new ways to share the wealth of our society, living more fairly and within environmental limits. Other parties may still take their time to catch up with us, but with that radical green message, we'll keep moving the agenda forward and keep leading the change in Scottish politics. Have a fantastic conference.